My wife, Janice, wanted half of everything I owned in our divorce. This demand came after she had rekindled a relationship with her ex-boyfriend, Brandon. On that day, I thought things couldn't get worse, but I was wrong. The entire week had been filled with stress at work. My boss, the president of the company, called me into his office to give me a stern talking to about a mistake that wasn't even mine. I felt overwhelmed and frustrated. When I finally arrived home, I found my sister-in-law Susan's car blocking my driveway, making it impossible for me to park in front of my own house. To add to my irritation, the neighbor's teenage son and his friends had parked cars all along the street, forcing me to squeeze my own car 3 doors down. I couldn't help but feel weighed down by the day's events as I walked toward the front door. My relationship with Susan had always been rocky since the moment we met. I didn't understand why she seemed to dislike me so much. This was the last person I wanted to deal with after a long day, and I had little hope for a warm evening with Janice. We hadn't been intimate in almost a month despite my constant efforts to reconnect with her. As I approached my house, I noticed an empty garbage can sitting by the curb. I dragged it around to the side of the house and put it next to the back door. Stepping into the kitchen, I heard music and the familiar sound of Janice and Susan chatting in the living room. I opened the fridge, grabbed a beer, and took a sip as I headed toward them. Suddenly, a shocking sentence stopped me dead in my tracks at the doorway. I overheard Janice saying, "God, he took me 3 times today." At first, I thought it was Susan speaking, but the words came from my own wife. Janice went on to confess how she couldn't get enough of Brandon since he had returned to town last month. My heart sank as I realized that Brandon was the very person who had once broken her heart and left her for a new life away from us. "What are you going to do now?" Susan asked, her tone filled with curiosity. Janice replied that Brandon wanted her to move in with him, and she planned to get a lawyer and file for divorce. "This is a community property state, so I'll get half of everything," she said matter-of-factly. That was it. I had heard more than enough. I numbly made my way back to the rear door, retracing my steps to my car. Sitting in the driver's seat, I felt the weight of Janice's betrayal. The intimacy I had been hoping for had been shared with someone else. Now, on top of that emotional blow, my wife expected me to hand over half of everything I owned. The thought was almost unbearable. To make matters worse, I realized the state laws were likely to support her claim. Janice and I had been married for just 3 years. Right after we got married, she had quit her job, and during our time together, I had hired a maid to help around the house. On those days, she would cook dinner, but the rest of the time, I either prepared meals or ordered takeout. I had been blinded by love, thinking that our relationship would only grow stronger. My childhood had been difficult. I lost my mother when I was just 13, which was an enormous challenge for my father and me. My dad did everything he could to raise me well, and we grew very close. Losing him in a tragic car accident when I was 23 hit me hard, especially since it happened just a year before I met Janice. After my father's death, I inherited nearly $2.5 million from him, and I chose to keep that money invested with the help of a trusted broker. Despite Janice's frequent attempts to spend my earnings, I managed to save hundreds of thousands of dollars. I had not touched my inheritance, letting it grow even in tough economic times, which gave me some financial security. However, my love for Janice led us to skip a prenuptial agreement, something that many people overlook. This decision now meant she could take almost $1.5 million from me, all because she wanted to be with someone else. The state seemed ready to support this arrangement, which felt like a legal form of exploitation. I heard her mention a lawyer, which indicated she hadn't yet made any formal moves against me. This gave me some time to plan. I sat in my car, glancing in the rearview mirror until I finally saw Susan's car pull out and drive away. I took a deep breath, started my car, and made a U-turn. Walking back into my house, I noticed that Janice was nowhere to be found. Janice was nowhere to be found, leaving me alone in the house. I decided to head to the kitchen, craving another beer to take the edge off the day. As I popped the top off the cold bottle, I took a long drink, using the moment to think about my next actions. Just then, Janice walked into the kitchen, catching me off guard. "Oh, there you are, honey," she said, her voice bright and cheerful. I didn't even hear her come in. "Hello, dear," I replied, forcing a loving smile on my face, determined to play my role just as convincingly as she did. "It's been a long day," I added, masking my irritation with sweetness. She frowned slightly, expressing disappointment as she said, "I didn't have time to order anything for dinner." A part of me wanted to remind her that this was likely because she had spent her day with her boyfriend, sharing details of her escapades with her sister. Instead, I kept my mouth shut and replied, "That's okay, sweetie. I'll just heat up some leftovers from last night." Janice smiled at me sweetly, brushing her lips against my cheek before announcing her plans to head upstairs for a hot bath. I nodded, all the while thinking about how she probably needed to wash away the day's guilt. Once she left the room, I grabbed a plate of fried rice from the fridge and ate it cold. I washed it down with 2 more beers, letting the bitterness of the drink mingle with the bitterness in my heart. After tossing the empty beer container into the trash, I retreated to the den, slumping into my favorite chair as I flipped through the TV channels. Eventually, I settled on an old movie, but I hardly paid attention to it. About half an hour later, Janice returned, plopping herself down on the couch. She stayed there until the movie finished, and then stood up, yawning and declaring that she was tired and heading off to bed. Yeah, tired from being unfaithful, I thought to myself. I told her I would watch the news and join her later, but my mind was elsewhere. I hadn't really been focused on the movie. Instead, I was consumed with thoughts about my next move. I knew I couldn't act immediately, so I spent the next few days keeping busy. Saturday was filled with yard work, while Sunday saw me spending time on the golf course with friends. Finally, Monday arrived. I picked up the phone and called my broker, the person handling my inheritance portfolio. I made the decision to liquidate everything, knowing it was the right choice given my circumstances. Being in upper management allowed me to cash in my 401k quickly, even though there would be penalties involved. By Thursday, I was ready to execute my plan. I returned home to my supposedly loving wife and told her I had an emergency situation to address, explaining that I would be flying out for a week on company business. I packed 2 suitcases, realizing that was all I truly needed. When we moved into this house, I had stored away all the things that mattered to me. Everything else didn't fit her style, so I had no desire for any of it. The furniture was all chosen by her, and frankly, I couldn't care less about it. Luckily, we were renting the house, so there was no financial burden tied to it. I had recently sold my condo, and we were in the middle of searching for a new house to buy. However, what I meant by new house really came down to what she wanted, and so far, none of the options we viewed met her high standards. On Friday morning, I leaned down and kissed Janice on the cheek one last time. I grabbed my suitcases and carried them out the door, loading them into my Lexus. I drove away without looking back, feeling both relieved and anxious. My first stop was at my old buddy Jake's place. I trusted him completely. When I proposed a trade for his older but rebuilt 4-wheel drive vehicle, he was surprised yet willing to help. I let him in on my situation, and after about an hour, I was headed west in my new vehicle. I was sure no one would connect me to this car, and Jake promised to keep my traded vehicle hidden in his garage for a while. For the next 4 days, I paid for everything in cash. I had cancelled all of our credit cards to avoid leaving any traces. Most of my money was now safely tucked away in an offshore account, thanks to my broker, who had set up a system for easy fund transfers. I had enough cash hidden in the SUV to last for a while. Nights alone in motels were the hardest part of this entire ordeal. For the past week, I had been so focused on executing my plan that I hadn't taken the time to reflect on my feelings. I had loved Janice deeply. I wouldn't have married her if I hadn't. In my mind, I ran through various what-if scenarios, but I ultimately concluded there was not much I could have done differently. Even if I had known about her old boyfriend returning, I doubted I could have kept them apart. I arrived at 2 hard truths: she probably never truly loved me, and it was my fault for being foolish enough to marry her. This realization hit me hard on the 5th day away from home. On the 5th day away from home, I found myself sitting in a small, cozy diner owned by a local couple in a quiet town in Montana. As I sat there, I couldn't help but think about what my wife might be doing at that moment. By now, she must have realized that all her credit cards were cancelled and that our joint bank account was empty. The thought of her discovering these changes filled me with a mix of worry and frustration. Just then, my thoughts were interrupted by the soft voices of an older couple at the next table. I couldn't help but hear snippets of their conversation. The man, who seemed to be in his late 50s, spoke to his red-haired wife about the struggles they were facing on their farm. He expressed his wish for an extra pair of hands to help them out. However, he explained that they couldn't afford to hire any help until their calves were ready for market. Even then, he added, it would be tough to find someone willing to work for the low pay they could offer. As I finished the last bite of my meal, I felt a sudden urge to reach out. I stood up and approached their table, offering my apologies for eavesdropping but suggesting that I might be able to assist them. The older man looked me over carefully, sizing me up with a cautious expression. "I don't see how you could do that," he said, his voice heavy with skepticism. "If you heard what we were talking about, you know I can't pay you anything." I decided to be straightforward and replied, "What if I just need a place to stay in exchange for my work?" His eyes narrowed further as he appeared to consider my proposal. "Colleen, excuse us for a moment while I speak to this young man outside," he said to his wife. He then stood up and gestured for me to follow him. Once we were in the parking lot, away from prying ears, he turned to face me. I estimated him to be around my height at 6 feet, with broad shoulders that suggested a life of physical labor. His hair, once dark, was now mostly gray, and deep lines marked his face, telling the story of years spent working outdoors. "Who the hell are you?" he asked, his tone laced with suspicion. "Are you part of that Wilson ranch?" I quickly raised my hands defensively, wanting to assure him. "Hold on there, mister. I don't know anything about any Wilson. 4 days ago, I was living in Texas, and I just arrived here this morning. I thought maybe we could help each other out." He listened, but I could tell he was still wary. "If what you say is true, why would you want to help us out? I can't afford to pay you anything. What's in it for you? If you're on the run from the law, we don't need that kind of trouble." I took a deep breath and said, "Well, I'm probably on the run as you put it, but it's not what you think. Here's the truth, my wife has been unfaithful and wants to take me to the cleaners. I'm just trying to keep what's rightfully mine. If you have a place I could stay, I'll repay you with my labor. I'll make sure to pay my way, and if you find I'm no help, just tell me, and I'll leave with no hard feelings." He studied my face for a moment, weighing my words carefully. "If what you're telling me is the truth, I think I'd be a fool not to at least give you a shot," he finally said. "I have to tell you up front, though, the Wilsons are trying to get me to sell my land to them. They haven't done anything underhanded yet, but I wouldn't put it past them. You might be biting off more than you can chew." I assured him that I understood the risks and was willing to take them. He then asked about my ranching experience, and I answered honestly that I had spent a few summers on my uncle's ranch in Texas, but I was no cowboy. He extended his hand, and we shook on our agreement. "You can call me Bill," he said, and I introduced myself in return. We walked back into the diner, where Colleen waited for us. Bill called out to her, "Colleen, this is Carson. He's going to be working for us if he can handle it." She stood up and extended her hand, greeting me with a warm smile. "It's very nice to meet you, Carson," she said, her voice clear and friendly, possibly with a hint of an Irish accent. Like her husband, she seemed fit and lively. I returned her greeting, saying, "It's nice to meet you too, Ma." She responded, "The last name is Buckman, but you can just call me Colleen. We don't really have much use for formality around here." I found myself instantly liking this warm woman. After a brief conversation, Bill suggested we head back to the ranch. Before leaving town, he parked in front of a general store. "You might want to pick up some clothes suitable for working on the farm," he advised as we both stepped out of the vehicle. As he entered the store to pick up some clothes suited for ranch work, he was greeted warmly by the owner. It was clear that he was a regular customer, and there was a sense of familiarity in the air. He browsed through the aisles and decided on a durable coat and a pair of Western-style riding boots. These choices would be sufficient for his needs during his first week on the ranch. After making his purchase, he hopped back into his truck and set off for the main gate, which was about a 20-minute drive away. The gate was marked with an arch that proudly displayed the name, Rocking Bee Ranch, the brand that belonged to Bill. Once he reached the gate, he continued down a private road for about another mile that led to the main house. The two-story residence was situated on a rise, well-maintained and freshly painted, giving it a welcoming appearance. As he looked behind the house, he noticed a barn and several outbuildings, which added to the ranch's rustic charm. The pickup truck he noticed was partly loaded with sacks of groceries, indicating that the Buckmans had just finished their weekly trip to town for supplies. He parked his truck behind the Buckmans' vehicle and filled his arms with bags from the truck bed. He made 2 trips in total to unload everything, following the Buckmans into the kitchen. Once they were done unloading, Bill instructed him to drive around to the back of the property, where he showed him a small cabin that would be his temporary residence. When he pulled around, he spotted Bill waiting in front of the cabin. Bill pointed out the cabin and mentioned that Sam, another ranch hand, used a similar cabin just a few yards away. He added that Sam was currently out making his rounds and that Carson would get to meet him later. After unloading his bags, Bill was patient while Carson settled into the cabin. The cabin was a simple but tidy space with one large room containing a bed along one wall, a small table with 2 chairs, a pot-bellied stove in one corner, and a bathroom that featured a single stone shower. While the accommodations were not luxurious, they were clean and provided a suitable place for Carson to stay for the time being, allowing him some peace of mind as he hoped to avoid being found by Janice. Once he was outside again, he saw Bill sitting in his pickup. Bill invited him to hop in for a tour of the ranch, which spanned almost 6,000 acres. Along the way, Bill pointed out a couple of 100 acres set aside for growing winter feed while explaining that the ranch's back section was hilly and wooded. This area led to mountains, with a stream flowing through the property that could only be accessed on horseback. Bill shared that he used to employ 3 full-time hands, but now Sam was the only one left due to tough times in the ranching business. Sam had worked at the ranch for nearly 30 years. During the busy times, like roundups when cattle needed to be selected for market, they would hire extra help. After giving Carson the tour, Bill dropped him off at the little cabin. On the way, Bill casually mentioned that he noticed Carson carried a laptop. He shared that the ranch had a satellite connection with a router, allowing Carson to access the internet wirelessly. Before driving off, Bill mentioned that supper would be served in the main house at 6 o'clock. In less than half an hour, Carson had settled into his new home. He took a moment to boot up his computer, and as promised, he was able to connect to the internet. Excitedly, he checked for emails and found one from Jake. The message revealed that Janice had reported him missing to the police, and they were actively investigating his disappearance. This news gave him plenty to think about, especially since he had only confided in Jake about his plans. Even Jake didn't know where Carson was headed. He had mailed his resignation to his former employer but had not had the chance to explain his departure in person. As 6 o'clock approached, Carson made his way over to the main house and knocked on the door. Bill called out for him to come in. Upon stepping inside, Carson saw Colleen busy preparing food while Bill stood talking to a man he presumed to be Sam. Bill motioned for Carson to join them. "Sam, this is Carson, the new hand I mentioned," he said with a broad grin. "At least for today, we'll see how he feels about it tomorrow after a day's work." Carson introduced himself, extending his hand to Sam, who greeted him with a warm smile. Sam was a big man, standing at least 6 feet 3 inches tall, and like Bill, he appeared to have worked hard throughout his life. They seemed to be around the same age. One noticeable detail about Sam was that he was African American. As Carson shook Sam's hand, he felt a firm grip that conveyed strength. "Well, young man," Sam said, "let's hope you like it here. I could use the help." At 28, Carson was about half Sam's age, so Sam referred to him as young. Carson replied confidently, "I plan to give it my best shot." Just then, Colleen called them to the table as supper was ready. Bill and Colleen sat at opposite ends, while Carson and Sam took a seat across from each other in the middle. On the table, a large platter of pork chops awaited them, signaling the start of what promised to be a warm and hearty meal at the Rocking Bee Ranch. On the table in front of us lay a generous platter filled with succulent pork chops, their golden brown crusts glistening under the warm light. Next to it was a large bowl brimming with creamy mashed potatoes, their buttery richness inviting us to dig in. Another bowl held a vibrant array of fresh green beans, their bright color adding a splash of life to the meal. Completing the feast was a plate piled high with biscuits that clearly had been made right in the kitchen, fluffy and warm. Colleen spoke up, saying, "We don't eat fancy here, Carson, but there's plenty, and it's filling." I nodded in agreement, admiring the spread as I replied, "It looks great." As we began to eat, I turned to Bill and inquired if he had lived in this area all his life. With a proud smile, he responded, "Yep, my grandfather started this ranch, passed it on to my father, and now it belongs to me and Colleen." He continued with a hint of nostalgia, "When I was younger, I wasn't so sure she was going to be a part of it. I had to fight off every man to get her." His gaze shifted to Colleen, and in that moment, I could see the deep love he held for her reflected in his eyes. Colleen playfully replied, "Now, Bill, you know you're the only man I ever had eyes for. I just had to make sure that you wanted me enough." Bill then shared, with a warmth in his voice, "My wife has been responsible for the 3 happiest days of my life, the day she agreed to marry me, the day she actually married me, and the day she gave birth to our daughter, Caitlin." I looked around, noticing the absence of any signs of a child, and Colleen seemed to read my curiosity. "Our daughter is away right now," she explained, finishing her doctorate degree in veterinary sciences at South Dakota State University. "She has only been able to come home for the holidays. We are anxiously waiting for her to return home with her degree. She's supposed to be back in a couple of months." Bill added, "It'll be nice to have a vet in the family, should help cut down on some of the expenses." After we finished our hearty meal, I tried to help clear the dishes, but Colleen insisted that it was her responsibility and gently waved me away. Bill then informed us that breakfast was set for 5:30 a.m. and that work would commence promptly at 6 a.m. As Sam and I were leaving the house, I noticed a copy of that day's New York Times lying on the counter, likely picked up by Bill during a trip into town. I asked if I could borrow the front page for a moment and he agreed without hesitation. Once outside, I invited Bill to step into my cabin briefly. Inside, I retrieved my digital camera and demonstrated how to use it. I asked him to take a close-up picture of me holding the front page of the newspaper. I noticed his curiosity, but he refrained from asking questions. He did, however, inquire about an alarm clock, and I assured him that I had one. Bill nodded, saying he would see me in the morning before heading out. After he left, I downloaded the picture onto my computer and began drafting an email. I included a note for the police in my former hometown that stated I was alive and well and had left town of my own free will. I chose to use a national newspaper instead of a local one to keep my exact location unclear. I sent the email to my friend Jake, instructing him to use one of the local coffee shops that offered free internet access, knowing my work email would likely still be active. I provided him with my password so that he could forward the original email and the picture to the police without leaving any traceable paths. I hoped this strategy would help me avoid being listed as a missing person at the federal level, assuming the police wouldn't put significant resources into searching for a runaway husband. That night, I slept soundly, feeling a sense of relief. The next morning, I woke up at 5 a.m., took a quick shower, and dressed quickly so that I could walk with Sam to the main house for breakfast. After eating, Bill instructed Sam to put me to work replacing fence posts in a hilly section of the ranch. Following Sam to the barn, he pointed out a horse and saddle that I would need for the task. I felt a sense of satisfaction as I saddled the big brown horse, drawing from my experiences at my uncle's ranch. We then took 2 mules, attaching saddle packs to carry the fence posts and a post hole digger. Bill joined us at the barn, carrying a Winchester Model 94 rifle in a saddle scabbard. He explained that it was mainly for the rare occasion when they might need to put down a sick cow. With Bill mounted and leading the mule, Sam and I followed him as we headed out, tracing the path along the creek and up into the hills. As Sam and I rode, we engaged in conversation and began to learn more about each other. I shared my story of how I ended up in Montana, trusting that he would respect my confidence. In return, Sam recounted his own experiences, revealing that he had married shortly after high school, only to find his ex-wife in bed with another man. Through our shared stories, a bond began to form as we ventured into the day's work ahead. Upon entering the house, he stumbled upon a shocking sight, his ex-wife in bed with another man. Fueled by a mixture of betrayal and rage, he lost control and nearly beat the man to death, an act that would change his life drastically. It resulted in a 5-year prison sentence. Once he was finally released, he found that opportunities were scarce, except for one person who was willing to take a chance on him, Bill. This marked the beginning of a new chapter in his life, as he spent the next 30 years working on Bill's ranch. Sam, reflecting on his experiences, spoke highly of both Bill and Colleen, considering them to be some of the kindest people one could ever meet. After about half an hour of walking, we arrived at the fence that marked the boundaries of their property. Sam informed me that not all the fence posts needed to be replaced, only those that had rotted or were on the verge of falling apart. He estimated that approximately every 3rd post would require attention. To ensure I was doing the job correctly, Sam stayed with me while I replaced the first 2 posts. He suggested that we work until around 4 p.m., giving me enough time to return, take care of the horse and mules, and have dinner at 6 p.m. Before he left, he advised me to follow the stream back down to avoid getting lost. With Sam gone, I was left alone to tackle my work. I worked steadily along the fence line, replacing the old posts with new ones. When noon arrived, I took a break and grabbed the pork chop sandwiches that Colleen had given me that morning, stowed away in my still bag. After finishing my lunch, I returned to my work. At 4 p.m., my watch alarm beeped, reminding me it was time to wrap up. I realized I had only a couple of posts left to replace, thanks to the mules who had helped carry them up earlier. Leading the mules, I traced back along the fence line until I found the stream and began my descent. Just before emerging from the trees, I discovered a natural pool where the stream flowed in and out, creating a picturesque view. I paused to admire this stunning and peaceful spot, recognizing it as one of the most beautiful locations on the entire ranch. When I made it back to the barn, I efficiently unsaddled the animals and fed them in time. While I was tending to the horses, Sam entered to take care of his own horse. We quickly washed up and changed before supper, where we were treated to delicious steaks. That night, feeling exhausted from the day's labor, I barely contributed to the conversation and excused myself right after dinner to head to bed. Once my head hit the pillow, sleep enveloped me quickly and deeply. The next morning, I woke up feeling sore all over. My hands ached from using the post hole digger, and my arms, shoulders, and legs throbbed. Despite keeping to my regular workouts, nothing prepared me for the physical toll of a full day spent setting fence posts. As I limped into the kitchen and winced while sitting down, I could see Bill and Sam share a couple of chuckles. Even Colleen couldn't fully hide her grin. Despite my discomfort, I felt hungry and eagerly dove into my breakfast, mentally preparing myself for another day of fencing. After we rose from the table, Bill inquired if I was ready for another day of work. I groaned but replied with a hopeful, "Yes, sir," trying to convey more enthusiasm than I truly felt. Bill laughed and said, "I think you can give it a rest today. I'd like you to ride the rounds with Sam." I nodded appreciatively, happy for a change in tasks. We started our day by cleaning the stalls and replacing the hay. After putting the horses and mules out in the pasture and filling their feeder, we loaded up in the pickup and set off for our ranch inspection. Our main focus during this ride was to ensure that none of the cows were down or separated from their mothers. Sam seemed to have an instinctual understanding of the ranch. He effortlessly predicted where the cattle might be and could estimate their numbers with ease. After 30 years of working the land, it was a skill that appeared to come naturally to him. When we reached the far end of the ranch, Sam stopped the truck to survey the landscape. Something on one of the distant hills caught his eye, prompting him to hand me his binoculars and point to a specific area. After observing for a minute, I spotted 2 cows seemingly alone. Curious, I asked Sam where their mothers were, and he gestured toward 2 other cows near the tree line. "That's them over there," he said. "Their cows must have wandered into the trees, gotten lost, and kept going. We'll have to bring them down." I asked if we were going to hike up there and Sam replied, "Nah, it's too far. We'll go back and load up a couple of horses." The pickups were equipped with 2-way radios, so Sam called Bill to inform him of what we had found and that we were on our way to retrieve the horses. Upon returning to the barn, we found that Bill had already saddled 2 horses and loaded them into a trailer, ready for our next task. All we had to do was stock up on supplies and head out. Sam expertly guided us close to the tree line where the calves were located. Once there, we unloaded the horses and started riding up into the hills. Sam's 30 years of experience on the ranch was evident, as he navigated the terrain with ease, knowing it like the back of his hand. After about half an hour, we quietly approached the calves, carefully beginning to push them back down the hills. I couldn't help but laugh as we emerged from the trees. The wayward young calves spotted their mothers and ran toward them, bleating joyfully as they sought out a teat to nurse. The larger cows stood patiently, allowing their young to feed. It struck me how different this scene was from my own childhood. Our dinners back then often consisted of fried chicken, corn on the cob, and mashed potatoes. That evening, with newfound energy, I found myself engaging in more conversation than the night before. I learned more about Ken, a fascinating woman whose parents had immigrated to the United States from Ireland when she was just 5 years old. Her father, captivated by tales of the Old West, had brought the family to Montana. It was interesting to hear the slight trace of an Irish brogue in her speech. Even after growing up in America, she still carried the influences of her parents' heritage. Feeling much better the next day, I returned to the ranch after breakfast to replace some fence posts. Sam helped me load the mules, but this time I ventured out on my own. I found that following the stream led me directly to my destination. This day turned out to be easier than the first, as I had learned some tricks to make the work less strenuous. Just before 4 p.m., I set the last post and started my way back to the barn. With some extra time on my hands, I decided to work on cleaning some of the stalls before getting ready for dinner. On my 4th day, I assisted Sam with making repairs to several of the buildings around the ranch. The following day, I set more fence posts, and the next 2 months passed in a blur. I became responsible for riding the ranch to check on the cattle, and I felt like I was in the best shape of my life. We established a schedule where Sam took Saturdays off, Bill took Sundays off, and I had Mondays off. I used my day off to do laundry and run any necessary errands in town. As time went on, I grew quite fond of everyone on the ranch. Sam was good-natured and easy to get along with. We often shared conversations after supper. I respected Bill a lot. He was honest and hardworking, and we developed a good rapport. Colleen was very kind to both Sam and me, though I sensed she had a strong spirit beneath her sweet demeanor. Together, she and Bill made a wonderful couple. At breakfast on Friday, Colleen shared exciting news about her daughter, who would be returning home in just 1 week. That day, it was my turn to take a horse and ride through the wooded area to check for any cattle that might have wandered off into the hills. A little after 4 p.m., I made my way to the stream and followed it down to reach the pool below the waterfall. I paused, dismounted, took off my shirt, and knelt next to the cool water. Dipping my bandana into the stream, I began to wash the sweat and dust from my face and neck. As I was busy refreshing myself, a sight from downstream caught my attention. I turned to my right and saw a horse and rider approaching. Initially, I thought it was Colleen, but I quickly realized that this rider was much younger. The striking young woman could only be Caitlin, with her crystal blue eyes and red hair mirroring her mother's. Caitlin rode up and stopped several feet away from me. Standing up to face her, I felt a cold tone in her voice as she asked, "Who are you, "And what are you doing on this property?" I replied, "The name's Carson, and I work here." She looked skeptical and said, "I don't believe you. My dad said he couldn't afford to pay another hand." Despite her beauty, irritation crept in due to her unfriendly demeanor. I responded, "Yeah, I heard that too. Guess that's why I laugh all the way to the bank every payday." She gave me a sharp look, turned her horse around, and kicked it into a gallop. I chuckled to myself as I put my shirt back on, remounted my horse, and continued my ride toward the barn. Later, I discovered that there had been a misunderstanding between Caitlin and her parents regarding her return. They thought she would be back the following week, but much to their surprise, she had arrived just a couple of hours after I rode out. A couple of hours after I had gone riding, she spent her morning and the early part of the afternoon with her parents. Eventually, she expressed her longing to go for a ride, something that had been difficult for her to do while she was at school, despite her love for it. Eager to fulfill this desire, she saddled up her horse and set off towards her favorite spot, the picturesque waterfall and pool of water where she often found peace and joy. After 2 months of my absence, it seemed I was no longer the center of attention, as Bill and Colleen had forgotten to mention me during their conversations. As I returned to the barn, I noticed the back of the redhead disappearing inside. Dismounting my horse, I prepared to leave him inside the barn. Caitlin must have been searching for her father and had finally located him in the barn. I could clearly hear her voice, loud and curious, asking Bill about the man she had seen at the waterfall. Bill paused for a moment before responding, identifying me as Carson. She noted that I claimed to work here, but then recalled Bill had previously said he could not afford to hire another worker. Bill quickly confirmed that I indeed worked on the ranch, but when it came to discussing my wages, he asserted that it was not her concern, making it clear that he still ran the ranch. Caitlin challenged this by recalling that I had claimed to be overpaid, to which Bill responded with humor, asking me if that was true. At that moment, I stepped further into the barn, and while Caitlin had her back turned to me and didn't notice, Bill flashed me a knowing grin. I decided to play along, taking off my hat with one hand and scratching my head with the other. I replied, "Well, I would hate to take advantage of you, Bill. Just how much are you thinking of cutting my wages?" Bill and I both burst into laughter, but Caitlin continued to frown, clearly not finding the humor in our exchange. Bill tried to explain, saying, "Just so you know, Carson gets to stay in the cabin next to Sam's." Caitlin responded with curiosity, asking, "And what else?" Bill replied, "That, and he gets to enjoy your mother's excellent cooking." Caitlin pressed further, "So, you're saying you aren't paying him?" To which Bill replied, "He has his reasons, and it's not my place to share them." I chimed in, "Working to have a chance to taste your mother's cooking is worth quite a lot, and I'm sure she wouldn't appreciate hearing that it's nothing." Caitlin shot me one last glare before storming out of the barn, leaving Bill shaking his head. He remarked how much she reminded him of her mother in her younger days. That night at supper, Caitlin joined us, taking a seat next to Sam, who was sitting on the opposite side of the table from me. She cast another sharp look my way as I walked into the kitchen. I waited until everyone had filled their plates before I spoke, maintaining a pleasant tone. "Your mother tells me you've completed your doctorate in veterinary medicine." Caitlin responded with a curt, "Yeah," barely lifting her eyes from her plate. I continued, "Sam says there's only one other vet in the area, and he's over 30 miles away. I'm sure you'll be a great asset to the folks around here." For a fleeting moment, I thought I saw her eyes soften as she glanced up at my compliment. "Yes, that would be Dr. Harrison. He has more business than he can handle and is often needed in more than one place at the same time," she explained. "I agree with you, Carson. Our Caitlin will be able to provide a great service." Throughout the meal, Caitlin engaged in conversation with her parents and Sam, who had been part of the ranch long before she was born. She didn't speak directly to me, and I mostly stayed quiet, understanding that this was her homecoming, and her parents and Sam were eager to hear about her life while she was away. As soon as I finished my meal, I excused myself and headed back to my cabin. Upon arriving, I checked my email and saw a message from Jake. He updated me on his recent conversation with a friend in the police department, casually asking if they still considered me to be a missing person. According to his friend, all inquiries had ceased after they received the email containing the photograph I had sent them. As for Janice, it seemed that things had remained complicated. Brandon had apparently decided to end his relationship with Janice the moment he discovered that I had vanished along with all the money. This left Janice in a difficult position, as it seemed she would not have any chance of accessing those funds anytime soon. Without that money, she was unable to afford the rent on the house where we had been living together. Now, she was stuck in a small city apartment, working as a waitress just to make ends meet. The financial strain was evident, she couldn't even afford to hire a lawyer to chase after me. I found it somewhat ironic that she had married me primarily for my money, and it turned out that her new boyfriend had similar motives. He, too, was only interested in my finances. As for me, I was currently focused on the task of replacing fence posts, a project I had been working on for quite some time. However, I had found it necessary to slow my progress. I was now only working on the posts every third or fourth day. I had moved away from the hill where I initially stayed and relocated to an area where I could drive my pickup truck directly to the work site. This was far more practical, allowing me to load the fence posts in the back of the truck rather than using the mules, which had proven to be more complicated and time-consuming. On the morning after Caitlin returned home, I prepared for another day of work by loading up my truck with the necessary fence posts. I drove to the location where I had last left off and began my work. It was during my regular lunch break that I realized I had forgotten my lunch at the main house. Typically, if any of us were going to be working away from home all day, Colleen would make sure we had a packed lunch. I must have spaced out and neglected to grab mine that morning. Although I could have turned back to pick it up, I decided that missing just one meal wouldn't be the end of the world. Approximately half an hour into my work, after I had just set a new post and was in the process of attaching the wire, I heard the sound of a vehicle approaching behind me. Glancing back, I saw it was one of the ranch trucks pulling up. The truck stopped just as I completed my task. To my surprise, Caitlin stepped out of the vehicle, holding a small sack that resembled the ones Colleen used for our lunches. "Mom said you forgot your lunch," she said while extending the bag toward me. I reached out to take it from her. "Thank you, Caitlin." "That was very kind of you," I replied, noticing that the sack contained 2 sandwiches, just as I had expected. I pulled one out and offered the second one to her, but she shook her head in refusal. I shrugged, accepted that she didn't want any, and settled down on the tailgate of the truck to eat my sandwich. Caitlin came over and stood nearby, watching me silently. I kept my eyes focused straight ahead while I chewed, not wanting to make small talk. After a moment, she spoke up, breaking the silence. "Why are you here?" she asked, her tone curious. I turned to look at her and decided to toy with her. "You can't tell anybody I robbed a bank and stashed the money. I'm hiding out here until the heat is off and I can retrieve the cash," I said with a smirk. At first, her eyes widened in shock, but then she narrowed them as she glared at me. "You're a real clown," she huffed, turning to walk away. I waited until she was halfway to her truck before calling out her name. She stopped and turned around slowly. "I married a woman who never loved me and only wanted the things I could provide for her," I said, my voice more serious. "I ended up here because I just wanted to get away from everything I knew for a while." Caitlin stared at me again, and I sensed that she was beginning to believe me this time. She nodded her head and walked away without saying anything further. As she drove off, I thought about what her father had said regarding her mother. He mentioned that she had once been like Caitlin at that age, and he believed he had tamed her. However, I suspected that it was their love for each other that had truly kept them together. It had barely been a day since I first met Caitlin, and I couldn't imagine any man managing to tame someone as spirited as her. That evening, supper was almost a mirror image of the night before. Caitlin engaged in conversations with her parents and Sam while I sat quietly, feeling somewhat out of place. After all, Caitlin hardly knew me, and we had little in common. Just as we were finishing dinner, there was a knock at the door. Bill got up to answer it and returned to the kitchen with a man who appeared to be around my age. This newcomer fit the description that many women might call tall, dark, and handsome. Caitlin perked up instantly, calling out his name while leaping from her seat to hug him. It was clear they were familiar with each other, and they began chatting excitedly about how long it had been since they last saw one another. A few minutes later, there was another knock on the door. Bill answered it again and came back with another man. This one had light-colored hair but was equally good-looking. It was apparent that this evening was about to be filled with unexpected surprises. He was greeted warmly by Caitlin, her smile radiating charm and friendliness. As I reflected on Bill's earlier words, I remembered how he spoke of the relentless competition he faced from other men vying for Caitlin's affection. She was every bit as beautiful as her mother had been, and the allure she possessed was undeniable. After a moment of watching the interaction, I excused myself from the lively dinner table, feeling the warmth of their connection but knowing I needed some time alone. I returned to my cabin, wishing luck to the two fellows who were also interested in her. I felt a twinge of envy. If Caitlin turned out to be as wonderful as her mother, whoever won her heart would indeed consider himself a fortunate man. The next morning, I decided to take the pickup truck and explore the ranch. As I drove around, I began to sense that something was off. By the time I had completed my rounds, I felt a nagging feeling that the cattle numbers were not quite right. It was early in the day, and I decided to go back and get Sam. Together, we took a thorough tour of the ranch, and despite the many cattle roaming around, Sam agreed that something felt amiss. It seemed as if we were missing a few herds. After some discussion, we came up with a plan. We decided to saddle up our horses the following day and venture into the hilly areas of the ranch to investigate further. That evening, we shared our thoughts with Bill at dinner, and he nodded in agreement, supporting our plan. However, that night, rain fell steadily, making the search for tracks the next day more challenging. The morning arrived, and we loaded our horses into a trailer while Bill drove us to one end of the property. I rode about a third of the way up into the tree line, while Sam continued higher up the slope. We then traversed across the ranch, moving over hills and through thick patches of trees. It took us most of the day to reach the far side of the property. By the time we arrived, we had counted 5 stray herds. Bill met us when we emerged from the hills, and we loaded the horses back into the trailer, heading home while discussing our findings. We concluded that being more vigilant was our only option moving forward. At dinner that night, the atmosphere shifted as another suitor arrived for Caitlin. I heard her mother whisper something about this being the third young man to call on her that day. Word had clearly spread that Caitlin was back in town, and men were appearing from every corner, eager to catch her attention. Over the next 4 days, Sam and I dedicated ourselves to watching over the cattle closely. Everything seemed fine, except for the lingering worry about the cattle we suspected were missing. Caitlin's admirers continued to visit, yet she had barely spoken to me since the day she brought me lunch. On the 5th day after we noticed the loss of cattle, I expressed to Bill my desire to ride along the property line in the hills. We had already checked the fence lines near the pastures and found no signs of the missing cattle there. Sam dropped me off on the west side of the ranch, where Bill's land bordered the Wilson Ranch. Approximately halfway to the southwest corner, I spotted 3 fresh sets of horse tracks crossing from the Wilson side onto Bill's property. What struck me as odd was that the fence wire remained intact. I carefully dismounted and inspected the fence posts, noticing that the staples had been loosened on 5 posts, barely holding the wire in place. If someone were to remove the staples and lower the wire, it would create an opening to cross over unnoticed. I remounted and followed the tracks, which led me closer to a stream. There, I spotted 3 horses tied to a tree, situated a few yards above the waterfall. Staying cautious, I dismounted again, tied my horse securely, and retrieved my rifle from its scabbard. Approaching the horses, I could see boot prints leading downstream. I crept to the edge of the waterfall for a better look and gasped at the sight below. There was Caitlin, swimming gracefully in the pool below, completely naked in the water. The sight was stunning, and I couldn't help but admire her from afar. But just then, a movement caught my eye, pulling me back to the current situation. I quickly scanned the surrounding area and spotted one man to her right, with 2 more advancing toward the pond from the left. I raised my rifle, and with precision, I fired a shot that landed near the feet of the man on the right. A quick second shot stirred up dirt close to the 2 men on the left. Caitlin's piercing scream echoed through the trees, sending a chill down my spine. Standing up so that everyone could see me, I shouted, "On your bellies now! I won't miss the next shot!" I then called out to Caitlin, instructing her to stay where she was. I would not let the opportunity slip away. I called out to Caitlin, instructing her to stay in place. In that moment, she was unaware of the 3 men lurking nearby. Her attention was solely on me as I stood over her, rifle in hand. Panic set in as she instinctively tried to shield herself. One of the men on my left flinched, appearing ready to flee, but the bark of the tree beside him erupted into splinters as I pulled the trigger, solidifying his fear. He dropped to the ground, pressed flat. Caitlin turned to see the aftermath of my shot and let out another piercing scream upon spotting the 2 remaining men. I began a countdown, and before I could even reach 1, those 2 men also fell to the ground. After ensuring the situation was under control, I commanded the men to place their hands behind their heads, and they complied without hesitation. With urgency, I directed Caitlin to get dressed and get out of the pool. She hesitated, fear evident in her eyes, her body trembling, but I growled, insisting she follow my orders. Finally, she stepped out of the water. Though her back was turned to me, I couldn't help but watch her, captivated by the sight of her pale skin and the perfectly formed silhouette of her figure. That image would be forever engraved in my memories. She quickly put on her jeans and shirt, then mounted her horse. With one swift kick, she was off, disappearing through the trees. As soon as she was gone, I turned my attention back to the 3 men, ordering them one at a time to get up off the dirt and then lie down again. Only when all 3 were sprawled out before me did I finally exhale in relief. It was time to play a little bluff. I wondered aloud what I was going to do with this trio of troublemakers. I suggested I could shoot them in the legs, watching them bleed out painfully, a suggestion that elicited desperate pleas for mercy from the men. I responded by telling them that even if I spared their lives, Caitlin's father would be quick to seek justice for their vile intentions against his daughter. Then I posed a question, perhaps they had a more convincing confession for the sheriff. I proposed something like cattle rustling. It might lead to jail time, but at least it would offer them a chance at survival. The smallest of the men, who appeared to be the most rattled, finally cracked under pressure. He admitted, yes, we did it, while revealing that they had been working for Wilson, who had wanted to secure his land by any means necessary. His companion hushed him, urging silence, but he countered, insisting he wasn't willing to die for cattle. As I anticipated Caitlin's return and her father's inevitable inquiry into the situation, I knew I needed to stall for time. True to my expectations, about 45 minutes later, Bill and Sam rode in, their horses galloping toward me. I signaled for them to come closer as they reached the top of the rise. Bill was visibly confused as he demanded, "What in the hell is happening?" I explained that some of Wilson's men had intruded on us. I had followed them from the fence line only to find Caitlin swimming while they attempted to sneak up on her. While I kept my rifle pressed against the neck of the smaller man, I urged him to confess. He whimpered, finally admitting their involvement in the cattle theft, putting the blame back on Wilson. Bill, amused, tipped back his hat and exchanged grins with Sam, recalling how in his grandfather's time, horse thieves and cattle rustlers would be hanged. Justice was simpler then, he mused, before expressing regret about how things had to be more civilized today. While Sam stood watch over the three men, Bill and I decided to escort the rustlers down the way with our rifles at the ready. Sam took charge of tethering their horses together and brought up the rear as we made our way back to the buildings. We led the rustlers into the barn, putting them in separate stalls with doors that allowed us to monitor them without letting them see each other. Bill went into the house to make a call to the sheriff while Sam and I remained vigilant as guards. In less than 30 minutes, the sheriff made his way down the long mile-long drive. Bill quickly brought him up to speed on the unfolding situation. I suggested we bring out the smaller rustler first for questioning, and he agreed. I promptly had the small man brought outside. Initially, he hesitated, unsure if he wanted to speak up, but he soon reconsidered and began to talk. The sheriff exchanged glances with Bill and noted, "It looks like we have a straightforward case of trespassing here. Honestly, this isn't much of my concern, but I suppose I could leave the culprits in your care. I suppose I could leave things in your hands and forget I saw them. I'll let you handle it." The frightened rustler's eyes widened in fear as the sheriff approached. Suddenly, he began to talk, revealing everything. The sheriff acted quickly, calling for backup. Soon, a convoy of sheriff's vehicles made its way to Wilson's vast ranch. Even with the ranch's large size, the sheriff had no trouble pinpointing the location the rustler had provided. To everyone's shock, they discovered nearly 100 stolen cattle, all marked with the Rocking Bee brand. By the end of the day, Wilson and his partners in crime found themselves behind bars. After the chaos, it was well past 9 o'clock when we finally gathered for supper. Caitlin, though seated at the table with us, kept her gaze fixed on her plate, seemingly lost in thought. Bill, keen to understand what was going on, asked her, "What were you doing out there?" He addressed her, hoping to catch up since they hadn't had much chance to speak earlier. Caitlin replied, "I was just taking a swim. I didn't think anyone would come spy on me." At that moment, she shot me an accusing glare. I felt the need to defend myself and spoke up, "Firstly, Caitlin, I wasn't spying on you. I just traced their horse tracks to the stream. Secondly, think about what could have happened if I hadn't been there. I doubt those three were out there planning a picnic when they saw you swimming naked." Colleen chimed in, expressing relief, "Thank goodness you arrived when you did, Carson. I hate to think what could have happened." As the conversation shifted, we hurried to finish our meal, where we had an early start the next day. Exiting the kitchen and heading toward my cabin, Caitlin called out to me. I paused and waited for her to continue. However, she snapped, "So, did you enjoy the view today?" I had expected some gratitude, but that was too much to hope for. I responded, "Let's just say I'd be dishonest if I claimed it wasn't breathtaking." Caitlin huffed and turned away, marching off toward the house. I stood there shaking my head, realizing that there was something about me that seemed to consistently get under her skin. The following day, Bill had to go into town to file official charges against Wilson. He explained that returning the stolen cattle would take several days since the prosecutor needed to thoroughly document everything. While Bill handled the legal side of things, Sam and I spent the day refreshing the paint on some of the outbuildings. During lunch in the kitchen, Caitlin chose not to join us. I silently agreed with her decision. It suited me just fine. Bill returned early in the afternoon, but he decided to wait until dinner to discuss the developments. He explained that since this wasn't a capital case, Wilson and his accomplices would be released on bail. While he wasn't worried about any further trouble, he did advise us to remain vigilant. He glanced at his daughter with a mischievous grin and said, "If you're planning on another nude swim anytime soon, maybe you should take Carson along for protection." Caitlin's face turned crimson as she stood up in a huff and raced to her room. Bill, Sam, and even Colleen erupted in laughter at the situation. I chuckled along with them, enjoying the light-hearted moment. After the laughter faded, we resumed our meal. Bill continued to tease, saying, "I really want to thank you, Carson. Wilson could have seriously messed up this ranch financially. You're worth every penny." Together, we shared another round of laughter, feeling a sense of camaraderie. 3 days later, Bill received the news that he could finally retrieve his cattle. We loaded 3 horses into a trailer and drove to Wilson's Flying Doll Ranch, accompanied by sheriff's escort. Colleen came along to drive the truck and trailer back after we unloaded the horses. Once we arrived, Bill, Sam, and I got to work, pushing the cows back toward Bill's ranch. As we approached the Rocking Bee Ranch, I rode ahead to loosen the fence line, allowing the cattle to cross over. After ensuring all the cattle were back where they belonged, we secured the fencing and rode back to the main house, satisfied with the day's hard work. Meanwhile, Caitlin had been busy applying for her veterinarian license, a process that usually took around 45 days. Until then, she could only take care of the animals on her father's ranch. I would occasionally spot her around the property, and of course, at mealtime. Despite her silent treatment, if I managed to catch her eye, I would offer a big grin and wiggle my eyebrows, trying to lighten the mood. I would flash a big grin and wiggle my eyebrows, a playful gesture that was always enough to make her cheeks turn pink. This went on for 2 weeks after the waterfall incident, a moment we both remembered clearly. One day, while we were both in the barn, I decided to break the ice and asked her if she had been enjoying any swims lately. She approached me, standing just a few inches away, and shot me a piercing glare. "Why are you such a hole?" she snapped. I shrugged my shoulders, keeping my grin wide, and replied, "Why are you such a bee?" In an instant, her right hand shot out, aiming for my face. But I was quick, grabbing her wrist before she could make contact. Undeterred, she tried to strike with her left hand, but I caught that one too. With a swift move, I pushed both of her hands behind her back, pinning them and pressing her body against mine. I slowly lowered my face toward hers, and she stared right back at me, making no attempt to break free. In that charged moment, I said, "If you were mine, I'd put you over my knee and spank your butt." She attempted to pull back and shot me a challenging look. "You wouldn't dare," she replied defiantly. Suddenly, I let go of her wrists, and she stumbled backward, landing unceremoniously on her bottom. "It's not that I wouldn't dare," I said, my tone a mix of seriousness and playful banter. "I just got rid of one woman who doesn't care about me, and I'm not about to waste my time on another one." Traditionally, she would be the one to storm off in a huff, but this time, it was my turn to leave. I walked out of the barn, leaving her sitting there on the ground, clearly surprised. I didn't see her again until supper that evening. As expected, she didn't speak to me, but the look she shot my way was hard to interpret. I had never claimed to fully understand women, anyway. My previous marriage to Janice had shown me just how confusing relationships could be. The next day, I was busy in the barn, tending to the stalls when I noticed Bill walking in. It was his day off on Sunday, so I figured he wanted to talk about something. I couldn't help but wonder if Caitlin had brought up our little incident from the day before and if Bill had come to ask me to leave the ranch. I paused my work as he approached me and he said, "I heard you and Caitlin had a little showdown yesterday." That confirmed my suspicion. Caitlin had indeed confided in her father. Bill had a spark in his eyes as he continued. "Well, maybe it's not all your fault. I think her real issue is that she doesn't know what to make of you. At first, she thought you were here for something, but then you became the hero who saved her at the ranch. What she can't figure out is why you're not chasing after her like the other young men in town. You see, Caitlin is used to having boys wrapped around her little finger. She's had a few boyfriends, but none of them lasted long. I don't think she truly respected them, to be honest. Just make sure you don't let her chase you off. In my book, you're welcome here for as long as you want." I looked at Bill and replied, "Thanks, Bill. That means a lot to me. For Caitlin, I'll try to quit teasing her, and hopefully, we can live and let live." With that, he left the barn, and I went back to my work. I spent the rest of the day reflecting on what Bill had said. If Caitlin wanted to understand me better, it would be more effective for us to have a normal conversation rather than her current approach. As for chasing her like the others, that just wasn't going to happen. That evening, Caitlin didn't join us for supper, a fact no one discussed, and I didn't bother to ask about her. The following day, I stuck to my usual routine of waking up at 5 in the morning, even on my day off. After finishing breakfast alone, and once Sam and Bill left for work, I went to gather my laundry. Bill had invested in a large commercial washer and dryer, allowing me to wash all my clothes in one batch. Since the laundry room was next to the kitchen, I sat at the kitchen table, eating and chatting with Colleen while my clothes washed. Unexpectedly, Caitlin came in for breakfast, which was unusual for her since she often chose to eat later. Colleen asked me about my plans for the day, and I mentioned that I was thinking of driving into town. I asked if there was anything she needed me to pick up for her, and she replied that there were a couple of things she could use. I assured her I wouldn't mind at all. Just then, Caitlin jumped in, "Cool. I'll ride into town with you." I was planning to go to the general store for a few things, and it seems like a waste of gas for both of us to drive separately. I looked up in surprise and said, "Sure. I'd be happy to give you a ride." I agreed to give her a ride, something I hadn't expected at all after yesterday. I thought she might not even want to talk to me, let alone go somewhere together. I informed her that I needed about an hour and a half to finish my laundry before leaving. She assured me she would be ready by the time I was set to go. After preparing something to eat, she sat quietly at the table while Colleen and I continued our conversation. As I stepped out of my cabin, she emerged from the back door looking beautiful in a turquoise sundress that perfectly complemented her striking red hair. It was clear that she wanted me to notice her. She held the passenger side door open, and I watched as she gracefully slid into the car. With that, we began our drive, and during the first half of the trip, she sat quietly, looking out at the passing countryside. Then, unexpectedly, she broke the silence and mentioned that she thought I was going to kiss her the day before. I quickly glanced at her, but her gaze was fixed out the window, so I couldn't read her expression. I replied that while it wouldn't have been unpleasant, I had a personal rule about not forcing unwanted affection on someone who didn't seem interested. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw her head snap around, and I could sense her intense stare on me. Although she remained quiet, I caught her glancing at me now and then. When we arrived at the general store, we went inside together. I needed to pick up a couple of new pairs of jeans and shirts, while she had a list filled with items her mother wanted. After about an hour of shopping, we had everything loaded into the car. I still needed to stop by the hardware store for a few things for Bill, but hunger had started to set in. I suggested we grab a bite to eat, and she agreed, so we headed to the diner where I had first met Bill and Colleen. We took a table across from each other and placed our order. As we sat there in silence, I began to wonder if I should have just gone to the hardware store and returned to the ranch instead. Just then, the door swung open, and 3 guys walked in. I recognized 2 of them as the same guys who had previously come to see Caitlin. They approached our table, with 2 of them sitting down next to her while the third stood behind me. They ignored me completely and started chatting with her. Feeling a bit excluded, I stood up and motioned for the third guy to take a seat at our table, while I moved to another table nearby. When the waitress brought our food, I got her attention and asked her to place my meal in front of me. I quickly ate my food, paying little attention to the lively conversation happening at Caitlin's table. I left some bills on the table to cover our meals and stood up to leave. I noticed that Caitlin had hardly touched her food, her plate was still mostly full. "I'm going to run over to the hardware store. I can come back here later to see if you're ready to go," I said, interrupting their talk. She pushed her plate back and stood up, saying it was nice to see the guys again, but we had to leave. The guys tried to convince her to stay, with one even offering her a ride home, but she politely declined their offer and followed me out to the SUV. As we drove to the hardware store, Caitlin remained silent in the passenger seat, and I could sense a growing tension. The silence continued as we made our way back to the ranch, turning off the highway onto the mile-long driveway. "Why did you do that?" she suddenly asked, breaking the silence. "What?" I replied, unsure of what she meant. Moving to the other table, she clarified. "Well, I thought you'd rather spend time with your friends. Plus, I didn't want to be in the middle of whatever competition was happening for your attention." "You really are a jerk," she snapped. I held my tongue, not wanting to engage in an argument while driving. When we reached the main house, she immediately grabbed what she could carry as soon as I opened the back of the SUV. I picked up the remaining bags and followed her into the house. She dumped everything on the kitchen table without saying a word to her mother and then stormed off into another room. Colleen looked at me with a questioning expression. I shrugged and admitted, "I guess I'm a jerk." Colleen giggled and walked over, placing a hand on my arm. "I've never seen anyone have such an effect on Caitlin as you do." I assumed from the start that my only purpose was to annoy her. When I replied with this thought, she seemed uncertain, telling me she wasn't sure about that. Her answer left me puzzled, so I turned and headed back to my cabin. I put away the new clothes I had just bought, feeling a little restless. Instead of staying inside, I decided to go to the barn. I saddled up a horse and rode out, seeking a change of scenery. Before long, I found myself at the top of a waterfall. The weather was beautiful, and the sun warmed my skin as I tied the horse to a tree. Sitting at the edge of the falls, I gazed down at the calm pool of water below. Time seemed to slip away. I sat there for perhaps half an hour, lost in my thoughts. Suddenly, I spotted Caitlin riding up from below. She dismounted her horse, and I made sure not to draw any attention to myself. I didn't want to be accused of spying if she decided to go for a swim again. To break the silence, I picked up a small stone from the ground and tossed it into the water. The splash echoed in the stillness, causing Caitlin to look around for the source of the sound. When she saw me, I thought she might leave, but instead, she mounted her horse and rode up to where I was sitting. She tied her horse next to mine and walked over, stopping just inches away from me. "You're in a hole," she said, and without missing a beat, I shot back, "And you're still a bee." This time, I didn't wait for her to react with a slap. Instead, I quickly wrapped my arms around her waist and kissed her. I released her almost immediately, feeling a mix of excitement and nervousness as I tried to step toward my horse. But she grabbed my arm and spun me back around, leaving me speechless. Then, in a surprising move, she reached around my neck and pulled me in for another kiss. What began as a simple kiss quickly turned into something more passionate. As we kissed, our clothes somehow vanished, and we embraced, spending what felt like an eternity lost in each other's warmth. Gradually, our breathing returned to normal, and we remained in each other's embrace, savoring the moment in comfortable silence. Once we got dressed, we mounted our horses again and rode back down to the ranch. We stabled our horses, and without exchanging any words, she turned and walked towards the main house, leaving me alone with my thoughts. Back in my cabin, I slipped into the shower, and it struck me just how deep my feelings for her had become. I hadn't fully realized this until now. Quickly, I put on my clothes for supper. When I entered the kitchen, I saw Bill, Colleen, and Sam already gathered there, but Caitlin was absent. Just as we settled around the table, she walked in, but instead of taking her usual spot next to Sam, she chose the chair right beside mine. Bill and Colleen exchanged puzzled glances, while she simply smiled sweetly at them. During dinner, Caitlin was full of energy, chatting animatedly about whatever came to her mind. Her parents seemed curious about her cheerful mood, yet they didn't ask any questions, possibly sensing it was best to let her enjoy the moment. After the meal, she helped her mother clean the kitchen while Sam and I headed back to our cabins. Just as I had settled onto my bed, I heard a soft knock on my door. It was Caitlin. I opened the door and let her in, finding myself enveloped in her arms. We shared a tender kiss before she guided me back to the bed, shedding her clothes as she joined me. We made love, and afterward, we fell asleep wrapped in each other's warmth. The sudden sound of my alarm at 5 a.m. jolted me awake. With a groan, I reached over to silence the noise and reluctantly crawled out of bed. I turned on the bathroom light and dressed for the day, placing a gentle kiss on her head before sneaking out of the cabin. At breakfast, I couldn't shake off the feeling that Bill and Colleen were watching me closely. I wondered if they had any idea about their daughter's nighttime visits. After eating, I loaded the pickup for another day of work, setting fence posts on the ranch. Working alone provided me ample time to think, and my mind wandered to how quickly everything had changed in my life. Just 3 short months had passed since I left my wife, yet it felt as if years had gone by. I thought about the significance of Bill, Colleen, and Sam in my life, and my thoughts drifted to Caitlin, recalling the moments we had shared the day before. Could I find the kind of love they had? At lunchtime, I realized once again that I had forgotten to pack my meal. Just as I pondered my empty stomach, I heard a pickup truck driving up quickly. Caitlin jumped out and ran towards me with a bag in her hand. She leaped into my arms and kissed me passionately before handing me the bag, completely ignoring the fact that I had missed my lunch. I pulled her in for another passionate kiss, our lips meeting with an intensity that spoke to the connection we were building. Although I didn't set as many fence posts that day as I had planned, I made sure to set some significant markers in our relationship during those heated moments. Between our kisses, we took the time to share our thoughts and feelings. I opened up about my past, revealing how my ex-wife had betrayed my trust in ways that left deep scars. I assured her, the only way I will leave is if you tell me to go, hoping to ease any concerns she might have had. Eventually, the evening came to an end, and she returned home while I wrapped up my work for the day. After a refreshing shower and a change of clothes, I walked into the kitchen to find her busy preparing dinner. As I entered, she chose the seat right next to mine, further emphasizing the bond we were forming. Midway through our meal, a knock interrupted our conversation. Bill answered the door and returned with the same guy who had come by to visit Caitlin earlier. The moment he sat down, Caitlin looked at him, her expression unreadable, leaving me curious about her thoughts. The man broke the silence and asked if she would like to go for a drive. In our part of the country, where options for entertainment were limited, a drive was often understood as a date. Caitlin politely declined, saying, "I appreciate the offer, but I don't think my boyfriend would like it." She then leaned in and kissed me on the cheek, a gesture that made Mr. Tall, dark, and handsome blush and stumble over his words as he hurriedly made his exit. With that simple exchange, our relationship was now public knowledge. I glanced over at Bill and Colleen, noticing the smiles of approval on their faces, one of them sporting a big grin. We had officially become a couple. In the days that followed, there were no more visits from local men seeking Caitlin's attention. She made it clear that she was not available for anyone else but me. I found ways to support Caitlin as she pursued her dreams. She was in the process of seeking a loan from the bank to buy the equipment she needed for her veterinary business. However, the bank was reluctant to offer her an unsecured loan, and the only option available was for her father to put up the ranch as collateral. She hesitated to approach him with that request. I suggested that she give me a couple of days, as I might be able to come up with a solution. I contacted my offshore bank and established an account under the pretense of a fictitious loan company. Caitlin filled out a loan application on my computer, which I had set up to redirect to my email. After a couple of days of waiting, I sent her an email informing her that her loan had been approved and that a wire transfer would be made to her account soon. She was ecstatic at the news but had one question: why does the loan only carry a 2% annual rate? I explained to her that the organization was a non-profit philanthropic group that provided loans to individuals they believed would positively impact the community. I knew that I could have simply given her the money outright, but I understood that she was too proud to accept it without earning it. After putting in so much hard work to earn her degree, she was determined to succeed on her own terms. By the time Caitlin's license was approved, she had purchased a new van that she transformed into a mobile veterinary office, complete with all the necessary medical instruments. Once word got out about her license status, calls from local ranchers seeking her services came pouring in. Many nights, Caitlin chose to spend time with me in my cabin. Bill and Colleen were aware of our relationship, and they seemed to have no objections. At 27, Caitlin was old enough to make her own choices. It took 3 months for Wilson and his crew to face trial for their crimes. The case was relatively straightforward, and the smallest guy in the group cooperated with the prosecution, receiving 2 years of probation without any prison time. The other 5 men who had worked for Wilson each received 5 years in prison. As the mastermind behind the rustling operations, Wilson received the maximum sentence of 10 years and a hefty $50,000 fine. When he was taken to prison, I felt it was time to initiate an investigation into him and his ranch. I discovered that Wilson was single and had no family in the area. With all of his workers now incarcerated, there was no one left to manage the ranch. This situation led me to formulate a new plan for the future. However, before I could set it in motion, I had some unfinished business to take care of, finalizing my divorce. The thought of Janice receiving half of my money was unbearable. To address this, I reached out to my friend Jake, seeking his assistance once again. Instead of sending an email, I called him to ask if he could talk to Janice. I wanted him to communicate to her that I had made an effort to reach out and would like to propose a settlement in exchange for a divorce. I wanted to propose a settlement to Janice in exchange for a divorce. The offer was simple: I would pay her $50,000. If she refused, she would never hear from me again and would not receive any money at all. At first, she acted innocent and wanted to know why I had left and why I wouldn't come back. The situation changed dramatically when Jake revealed that I was aware of her affair with Brandon and that she wanted to divorce me. With her plan revealed, Janice, who was still working as a waitress and struggling to make ends meet, ultimately accepted my offer to move forward with the divorce. I needed to return to Texas and hire a lawyer to handle the divorce papers. Caitlin was not pleased when I told her about my departure. I explained that I needed to close this chapter in my life, and I reassured her that I would come back. Initially, I intended to leave my vehicle in long-term parking at the airport, but Caitlin wanted to take me and be there when I returned. This made it easier for her to accept my departure. I left behind my SUV and most of my belongings, taking only what could fit in a single suitcase. I flew out on a Sunday, and when I arrived, Jake picked me up at the airport. I stayed with him and his family, making sure to call Caitlin every night to keep her updated. By Friday, all the divorce paperwork was completed. Jake took Janice to my lawyer's office, where she learned that she would receive a check for $10,000 right away, with the remaining $40,000 to be paid in 60 days after the divorce was finalized. She signed the papers, and my lawyer handed her the check. I never had to confront Janice directly. After that, I realized I had personal items in storage that were important to me. These included keepsakes, heirlooms from my parents, yearbooks, and other sentimental belongings. Not wanting to make a second trip for them later, I decided to rent a moving van to collect everything. Caitlin was surprised when I told her that I wouldn't be flying back. But once I explained that I was bringing back all my important things, she became more excited about my return. It took me 3 days of relentless driving to cover the long distance. As I pulled into the Rocking Bee Ranch on Tuesday evening, I was greeted with enthusiasm from everyone there. That night, Caitlin continued to make me feel welcomed, and we talked until early morning before finally drifting off to sleep, exhausted but happy that the first part of my plan was accomplished. Now I was ready to move on to the next part of my plan, which involved making multiple trips to the prison where Wilson was being held. My goal was to convince him to sell me his ranch. Initially, he was resistant to the idea, but I kept presenting my case to him. I pointed out that he would likely be in prison for at least 7 years, and even with good behavior, he wouldn't be eligible for parole anytime soon. Without anyone to take care of his ranch, his house and property would most likely fall into disrepair, and his cattle could die without proper care during the winter months. I also raised the possibility that he might not be welcomed back in the community after his conviction. Faced with the risk of losing everything, he eventually agreed to my offer, which would give him something to restart his life with when he got out. The next step was to secure financing for the purchase. I moved my money back into the country, confident that Janice wouldn't risk her $40,000 by doing anything hasty. I negotiated a purchase price of $5 million with Wilson, which was less than the true market value of the property. This made it easier to find financing for the deal. I put down $500,000 as a down payment and financed the remaining amount. It took a month to finalize all the details. I kept my plans a secret from everyone except Caitlin and Bill, explaining that I had personal business involving my assets. Although the process only took 1 or 2 days of my time each week, I also set up a corporation and registered the land under its name. As summer ended and fall began, I hired someone to harvest the hay on the property. Additionally, I employed 4 hands to live on site and manage the ranch in the meantime. The most experienced hand was appointed as the temporary foreman. I made it clear that I would be an absentee owner for a while. Despite being close by, I assured him that he could always reach me by phone, and I planned to visit the ranch regularly. I had made plans to visit the ranch often. The last part of my plan was to remodel the main house, which was a 2-story structure with 5 bedrooms. It was clear that the house needed some updates and modernization. Although Caitlin was sometimes frustrated with my secrecy regarding my activities, our relationship continued to flourish. My love for her deepened with each passing day, and I sensed that she felt similarly about me. In the meantime, her veterinary business was thriving, which required her to be on the road a lot. Still, she remained happy and content in her work. There were moments when I almost revealed the details of what I was doing. After one of my visits to check on the remodeling, Caitlin confronted me with questions. "What is going on, Carson? Are you seeing someone else?" I quickly replied, "No, absolutely not. I swear there is no one else. I just have some things I need to take care of. Please believe me, I promise I will tell you everything soon. I need you to trust me." Caitlin scrutinized my face, searching for any hint of a lie. Finally, she said, "Okay, Carson, I do trust you, but you better tell me what is going on soon, or I am going to kick your ass." I couldn't help it. I grabbed her and kissed her, pouring all my love into that moment. As spring arrived and carving season began, the renovation of the main house was completed. At that point, it was time for me to carry out the final part of my plan. One afternoon, when I had Caitlin alone, I suggested we go for a drive. I shared my thoughts with her, saying, "I have been thinking that it is time for me to leave the Rocking Bee Ranch." Instantly, her eyes filled with tears, and she replied, "But I promised I wouldn't leave." I had carefully planned the moment so that we ended up at the entrance of the former Flying D Ranch, which added an air of mystery to the drive. I turned into the private road, and as we drove further in, I reassured her that I wasn't really planning on going far. Caitlin looked confused and uncertain, struggling to grasp what I meant. Her confusion deepened when she asked what we were doing on Wilson's land. I held off on giving a complete answer until we reached the main house. I asked her to come with me to see something special. When I got out of the truck, I went around to open her door. Taking her hand, I led her up to the front door and opened it. Caitlin asked again, "What are we doing here? We could get in trouble." I quickly assured her, saying, "Relax, Wilson doesn't own the ranch anymore. Let's look around, I want to know what you think of the house." We toured the house, starting upstairs where we walked through the various bedrooms before heading back downstairs. I could see the excitement on her face as she admired the large living room, the nicely paneled den, 2 home office setups, and a kitchen that I could tell she absolutely loved. The only room that was furnished was intended for my office. The rest of the house awaited her choices for decoration and furniture. I asked her what she thought of the house, and she replied that it was really nice. Curiosity took over, and she asked what was really going on. I could see the confusion and concern growing on her face, so I decided to drop to one knee. Reaching into my jacket pocket, I revealed the truth: Wilson no longer owns the ranch. I do, and I am asking if you could live here as my wife. Surprised, she asked if I really owned the house, to which I nodded eagerly. Her face erupted with joy as she screamed, "Yes." Following that, I took out the engagement ring from my pocket and held it up, proposing to her in that magical moment. At first, her expression scrunched up with disbelief, and her eyes brimmed with tears. For a moment, I worried that I might have made a mistake. But then, she tackled me onto my back and showered me with kisses. Finally, she extended her finger for me to place the ring on her. As she looked around the house with newfound excitement, I patiently waited for her to come running back into my arms. "The house is beautiful. I love it," she exclaimed with enthusiasm. I led her across the room to 2 doors that opened off a hallway. "There are 2 offices, one for you to run your business from and one for me," I explained, earning another long, sweet kiss from her. Excitedly, I took her into the office that had a desk and pulled out a large piece of paper. It displayed a drawing of a property gate with the words, "Double C Ranch," written across the top. This was the beginning of our new life together. Caitlin and I stood in front of our new place, the Double C Ranch, taking in the beauty of the land. She looked over the sign marking the ranch and asked what the Double C meant. I told her it stands for Carson and Caitlin Ranch. Hearing this made her emotional. She started to cry joyfully and began tugging at my clothes, filled with excitement. In that moment, I joined her, helping to strip away the barriers of our everyday lives. I lifted her onto the old desk in the office and we shared a deep and passionate kiss, marking the office with our love. In the days that followed, we explored every room of our new home together, making love and creating memories in every corner. After we finally collected ourselves and got dressed, I felt it was time for an important step. I told Caitlin it was time to share our news with her parents. She was so filled with joy that it seemed like she was floating as we walked to the truck. When we arrived back home shortly after 6 o'clock, we found Caitlin's parents, Bill and Colleen, along with her brother Sam, all gathered in the kitchen, preparing for supper. As we walked in together, Caitlin raised her left hand high and let out a squeal of excitement, announcing, "We're getting married." Colleen jumped up and rushed over to embrace her daughter tightly. Bill and Sam approached me, offering hearty handshakes and friendly pats on the back to congratulate us. I then received a warm hug from my future mother-in-law. Caitlin, still grinning, hugged her father and brother, relishing this moment of joy. Once the initial excitement settled, we all gathered around the table to share a meal. Caitlin patiently waited for everyone to dig in before casually mentioning that this would mean we would be moving. Her words caught everyone off guard, leading Bill, Colleen, and Sam to exclaim in unison, "What?" Caitlin looked at me, encouraging me to explain further. I took a deep breath and said, "Well, Bill, you know how Wilson wanted to combine his ranch with yours. I thought it could be a great opportunity for all of us." Bill rose from his seat, looking furious. He said there was no way the flying doll was going to get his ranch. I chuckled, attempting to ease the tension. I told him to take a breath and explained that the flying doll ranch was no more, it was now the Double C Ranch, and the new owners were sitting at his table. This left him in a state of confusion as he asked for clarification. I told him I had bought out Wilson and Caitlin and I now owned the ranch, officially dubbing it the Double C Ranch, standing for Carson and Caitlin. Colleen quickly understood the situation and nodded, but Bill still looked puzzled. I continued, I thought that if we combined the 2 ranches, we could run them effectively, and we could split the profits 50-50. Bill countered that the Double C Ranch was much larger than his ranch and brought in a lot more revenue. I assured him that I needed his expertise since he had experience running a ranch. I proposed that we be equal partners, with him in charge of operations and all final decisions. After all, it was part Caitlin's ranch too, and I believed in keeping things in the family. Bill sat back down and exchanged glances with Colleen, who nodded her approval. Finally, he extended his hand across the table to me. We shook on the agreement and he said, "Damn it, Carson, this is going to take some getting used to, but I accept your offer." I emphasized that this meant we would have more hands on deck to manage the ranch, with Sam taking the position of head foreman. I joked about pulling out all those fence posts I had spent so much time setting on that section of the property, and everyone shared a laugh. That night turned into a loud and joyous celebration. Caitlin stayed in my cabin, and we spent the night wrapped up in each other, enjoying every moment. The next morning, we awakened late, but luckily, everyone was still in the kitchen, waiting for us to join them for breakfast. After we ate, we were all excited to drive over to the Double C Ranch so Caitlin could show off our newly furnished home. Everyone was impressed during the tour, and I noticed Colleen looking enviously at the beautiful, refurbished kitchen. It had taken Caitlin and her mother an entire month to prepare the house, and it was perfect and ready for us on our wedding night. We had our wedding ceremony on the Double C Ranch, where Bill and his family were well respected among ranchers in the area. Families from miles around came to celebrate my marriage to Caitlin. That night, we enjoyed a perfect blend of warmth and welcome as I became part of their family and community. Later that evening, we finally went to bed together, and our time as newlyweds was filled with love and passion. As the next day rolled around, we found ourselves still nestled in bed, enjoying each other's company. However, on the third day of our marriage, I surprised my bride by taking her on a tropical honeymoon to Fiji, marking a new beginning for us. As the year progressed, our first roundup brought us great success, allowing us to send a substantial number of cattle to market, ultimately resulting in a nice profit. A portion of that profit went towards paying off loans, but thanks to Caitlin's business sense, we found ourselves living comfortably. We even built a lovely new house for Sam, who soon found a girlfriend his age living in town. It seemed that another wedding might be on the horizon, adding to our family celebrations. We may be preparing for another wedding in the near future. Time has flown by, and yet another year has passed. Recently, my beautiful wife shared some incredible news with me. She is pregnant. This means we are going to welcome a baby into our family, which is a thrilling development. As I reflect on this momentous occasion, I feel it is important to address a thought that some might have. There will undoubtedly be those who suggest that I should have learned from my past experiences and advised my wife Caitlin to sign a prenuptial agreement before we got married. However, if that is your viewpoint, then you clearly do not know my Caitlin very well. She is not like anyone else I have met. Unlike Janice, Caitlin puts in hard work at her job and manages to keep our home in order with dedication and care. She embodies the values that her mother taught her, and she shows her love for me in so many ways every single day. When I look into her beautiful blue Irish eyes, I am reminded of that love. It is something I cherish deeply, and it reassures me that we are building a wonderful life together.